But first, police investigating the disappearance of Madeleine McCann have said they are still pursuing one significant line of inquiry. British detectives insist this ongoing lead is critical and could help provide answers. However, the only 4 people considered as suspects in the case have been ruled out.
Yes, next week marks 10 years since Madeleine went missing. Our crime correspondent Martin Brunt spoke to the Met Police Assistant Commissioner, Mark Rowley.
We've started with 40,000 documents. We've got the original Portuguese investigation, I think about 6 or 8 sets of private detectives who've done work. And we did appeals to the public. I think we did 4 Crime Watch appeals, hoovering in as much information as possible. Sifting that, structuring it and working through it is an immense effort. It's much more hard slog in reality than it is inspiration. That takes time and it takes system. That's what we've been working on. And what you've seen with the bits that have been reported publicly is those appeals, when we've announced suspects, when we've made particular announcements, is us slowly crunching through it and focusing our attention and making progress. And of course, you get, I think we've had 600 people who at one stage have come into being interesting to the inquiry. That doesn't mean they're all suspects, but people who were suspicious at the time or have got a track record which makes us concerned about them. We're trying to work through them and sift them and sift them and sift them and focus the inquiry increasingly. And when you're doing this then across a continent and with multiple languages, and you've got to build a working relationship with the Portuguese, which is now working really well in terms of our policing teams, you put all that together, that takes real time. But what we've achieved, so we've achieved a complete understanding of it all. We've sifted out many of the potential suspects, many of the people of interest, and where we are today is with a much smaller team focused on a small number of remaining critical lines of inquiry that we think are significant. If we didn't think they were significant, we wouldn't be carrying on, but we think they're significant.
Well, Martin Brunt is here. Martin, you conducted that interview with the Assistant Met Commissioner, and they talk about this significant line of inquiry, but we're still very much in the dark as to how significant it is and what it is.
Yes, everything he said yesterday rather left the impression that they're just clinging to something to keep the investigation going. Now, I don't know what this significant line of investigation is. In fact, it's interesting that during the interview at one point, Mr. Rowley spoke about several interesting or significant lines. And when I pinned him down and said, look, 6 years on, are you any closer to solving it? He then talked about one significant line. And then, of course, he said, look, I'm not going to give you any details because, you know, it's a live investigation. So you wouldn't expect him to reveal what it is. Whether it's a suspect, whether it's a witness, there was speculation in a newspaper report recently that there was one figure who was the subject of an international manhunt. I put that to Mr. Rowley and he sort of smiled and was very dismissive and said there are lots of newspaper stories that effectively are nonsense. So absolutely giving nothing away. And I have to say, throughout the interview, I never really got the impression from him that there was any real sense of expectation or optimism. As the former commissioner said a year ago, there was one piece of work left to do, and when that was done, if it didn't provide the answer, that would be the end of the investigation. And I think I got the same sense from Mr. Rowley.
And Martin, what's the involvement 10 years on of the Portuguese police?
Well, people perhaps have forgotten that the Portuguese police were the first investigators, of course. They abandoned their investigation after 15 months, after Madeleine vanished. But they reopened it in 2011. Coincidentally, Scotland Yard started their investigation around the same time. Difficult to say. But I've been over to Lisbon. I've interviewed the head of the Portuguese detective force, and he again effectively said that they were making progress, as Mr. Rowley has said, and by that they mean they're eliminating various lines of inquiry and focusing down on what might possibly provide the answer. Interestingly, I understand that the Portuguese police did not accept what Scotland Yard were pursuing, this theory of a burglary that went wrong. Much more important to the Portuguese investigators and what prompted their reopening of their investigation was a series of sex predator attacks on mainly British young children in holiday homes in the 3 or 4 years leading up to 2007. They did have a suspect, the Portuguese police. He was already dead. a guy called Euclides Monteiro, who had a connection with the holiday complex. By the time they zoned in on him as a suspect, potential suspect, he'd been killed in a tractor accident. But DNA eventually ruled him out, which does throw up the idea that there is still a sex predator out there.
So many different strands to the investigation. For now, Martin, thank you very much.